Greetings, my name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, www.regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos by Candace Rondeaux. On June 23, 2023, as the world watched with mouths collectively agape, longtime Vladimir Putin associate Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the notorious paramilitary force known as the Wagner Group, mounted a rebellion against the Russian military leadership over its fumbling prosecution of the war in Ukraine. Wagner mercenaries captured Rostov-on-Don almost unopposed and began a slow advance towards Moscow. This was not only the most significant challenge to Putin's increasingly authoritarian rule, but the most consequential threat to the legitimacy of the post-Soviet state in the 3 decades since Boris Yeltsin used tanks to shutter the Duma to forestall his own impeachment. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Prigozhin called off the mutiny, and all criminal charges were dropped as he agreed to relocate Wagner forces to Belarus. Not long after, it was reported that Putin hosted Prigozhin at the Kremlin, and fences were mended among the old allies. But few believed that would be the end of the story. So, on August 23rd, exactly 2 months to the day since the rebellion launched, perhaps it came as a surprise only to Prigozhin when the business jet carrying him and his associates exploded north of Moscow. So who was Yevgeny Prigozhin? What was his actual relationship with Vladimir Putin? What role did the Wagner Group play as an extension of Russian power, not only in Ukraine, but in Africa and the Middle East? And how could the thuggish ex-con paramilitary Prigozhin rise to such prominence to make international observers, albeit briefly, wonder aloud if he would be the instrument to topple the Putin regime? In a remarkable achievement, Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group, and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos, international expert and Arizona State professor of practice Candace Rondeaux brilliantly addresses these questions and much more in an extremely well-written, if dense, account that is at once a kind of dual biography of Prigozhin and Putin, as well as a nuanced history of post-Yeltsin Russia. It turns out that the intersecting avenues of, pardon the inevitable alliteration, Prigozhin and Putin were to be found on the streets of St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad. It was there that teenage petty thief Yevgeny Prigozhin grew up to be a violent gang member who spent nearly a decade in prison before he found himself selling hot dogs alongside his mother in an open-air market. Both street-savvy and entrepreneurial at a fortuitous moment when a fierce, nascent capitalism served as czar of the new Russian state, Prigozhin turned burgeoning profits first into the grocery store business, then, along with a pair of new partners, expanded into a variety of other enterprises that included the city's first casinos. The restaurant business was next. Here the duality that marked his character was most evident. He was at once markedly intelligent and adept in his every endeavor, as well as coarse and cruel when it suited him. He hired strippers to lure in diners before word got around that the menu was superlative, and he casually meted out violence to employees who failed to live up to his expectations. Prigozhin redefined upscale dining when he remodeled a rusting hulk into a floating restaurant known as New Island that became one of St. Petersburg's most fashionable eateries. New Island hosted key state dinners for Vladimir Putin, French President Jacques Chirac, and U.S. President George W. Bush. Prigozhin personally served Putin on more than one occasion, which earned him the playful sobriquet of Putin's chef. Putin, the former KGB agent who later remade Russia into his own fiefdom while dismantling the nation's fledgling democracy of all but its most superficial forms, could be said to be as much of a thug as Prigozhin on many levels, even if a more polished and articulate one. Both St. Petersburg natives who made good, Putin went to university and Prigozhin went to prison. You can at once envision Prigozhin with bloody knuckles and Putin filing a nail while ordering a rival tossed out a window. The end result is the same. The two men most likely first encountered one another when the ex-con was in his casino business phase and Putin, who had held a number of significant political positions in the city, was serving as chairman of the supervisory board for casino gambling. Over time, they grew to be close associates, and even friends of a sort, with Prigozhin growing fabulously wealthy off government contracts awarded to his catering business. As Putin evolved from president to autocrat, he came to govern Russia much like an organized crime family, with his oligarchs, whose fortunes depended upon his favor, acting as loyal capos. Corruption clung to every corridor of Russian government and society. It suited Prigozhin well. He became a jet setter who owned his own jets, and he moved into a compound that sported both a basketball court and a helicopter pad. And he diversified. Some of his riches were pumped into Prigozhin's so-called Internet Research Agency, a Russian troll factory later infamous for U.S. election interference as it promoted Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton's candidacy through a web of social media bots. But it was as head of the Wagner Group that Prigozhin cemented his stature as a key oligarch closely aligned with Putin. A private military group that offered Russia plausible deniability in covert actions abroad, Wagner operated ruthlessly in geographies as remote from the Kremlin as Africa and the Middle East. Many found it impossible to unsee the widely circulated 2017 video of Wagner mercenaries first torturing and then using a sledgehammer to beat to death a deserter from the Syrian army. The sledgehammer became an unofficial Wagner emblem. But long before Syria, Wagner filled the ranks of the so-called Little Green Men of professional soldiers with no insignia, who appeared suddenly in 2014 in Crimea and in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, euphemistically identified by Moscow as organic separatists eager to secede and join the Russian Federation. Putin's brand of neo-fascist irredentism drew heavily on Hitler's playbook. The Austrian Anschluss was almost effortlessly replayed in Crimea, and the Donbass would be the new Sudetenland. Meanwhile, Prigozhin and his Wagner group would be the poorly disguised blunt instruments on the ground, as well as on plenty of other grounds, where shadow wars were conducted on distant continents and Russian power could be unofficially and mercilessly enforced. But absorbing eastern Ukraine proved a stubborn objective, and the West responded with economic sanctions rather than appeasement. Perhaps Poland 1939 would make for a better model. On February 24, 2022, tanks rolled in, an act of unprovoked aggression not seen in Europe since World War II. But Russian ambitions turned out to be over-optimistic, to say the least. Putin expected to occupy Kyiv in a matter of days, but that was not to be. Ukraine held out. Joe Biden was president, not Donald Trump. Europe and NATO stood firm. But this spawned new opportunities for Prigozhin. He could rip off the mask, take Wagner out of the closet, and operate freely in Ukraine with his mercenaries as well as convicts recruited from Russia's penal system. Yet the war dragged on. Gains were few. Russian losses were magnified. Military effectiveness was handicapped by a culture of corruption not dissimilar to that which marked the rest of the state. Frustration fueled Prigozhin's conviction that the stalemate might be broken if he was in charge, if only things could be done his way. He developed a heightened sense of self-importance. He clashed with high echelons of the military machine as well as with rival Russian nationalists. He made a lot of enemies. Still, Putin gave his old friend a lot of leash, until the day that Prigozhin came to believe his own bullshit. Putin's chef proved to be the recipe for his own undoing. Putin's Sledgehammer is a magnificent book, but its inherent complexity and the level of detail it contains hardly makes for an easy read. I had the advantage of coming to it after previously poring through volumes by Peter Conradi on Russia, Thomas Duvall on the Caucasus, Serhii Plokhy on Ukraine, and Timothy Snyder on geopolitics. A talented writer whose work is based upon impeccable research, Candace Rondeaux ranks among those esteemed authors, but her work is not for beginners. Maps and a timeline would have been helpful. There's also a dizzying array of characters, organizations, acronyms, etc. that are hard to keep track of, especially for those unfamiliar with Russian names and places. She does include a somewhat comprehensive table of principal players, but because these are arranged by association rather than alphabetically, it is less helpful than it should be. Still, these are quibbles. This book will likely not only come to be considered the definitive biography of Yevgeny Prigozhin, but will certainly be counted as an extremely valuable contribution to the historiography in ongoing studies of the contemporary Russian state. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews and an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarbbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.